you, Chris, for allowing me to attend the meeting online. So my talk is really about this notion of crisis and how it is linked to the Serres concept of parasite. The COVID health crisis has confirmed the view developed by Serres that all contemporary crises, health, climate, financial, and political, are expressions of the relations between humans and the world. This anthropological account of the contemporary crisis has to be understood against the background of the Anthropocene. Although the Anthropocene enjoyed a wide circulation from 2008, Serres did not stand as a prominent advocate of this concept. He didn't jump into the Anthropocene studies like Bruno Latour did, for instance. He was content with occasionally mentioning the term, sometimes as an adjective and sometimes as a substantive. One reason for that is that he himself developed a similar diagnosis of the climate crisis in his own language in the series of books initiated by Hominiscence, the tetralogy. So in order to compare Serres' Grand Récit and the narrative constructed by the scientists who championed the Anthropocene, I will first briefly say a few words about the introduction of this term and also about Serres' notion of parasite linked to the crisis. A crisis is a parasite for Serres. And he already made it clear in the 1980s that living with parasites is an ancestral experience rather than a moment of temporary crisis. And crisis is nevertheless a specific moment in this long experience because it breaks the normal course of things and disturbs the ordinary circulation of fluids in the organism. Sickness in general is a form of parasitism in the sense that it intercepts the circuits of the organism, and the crisis is a moment of suspense in the long-term parasitic process. I quote, "The crisis is itself in a state of transition between two phases that can be pinpointed, where a transformation will be decided, where it has yet been decided. It has not yet been decided. It is a state of swinging of the balance beam." So we are here in this state, and we know that the term crisis, coming from the Greek krino, to judge, is the time when decisions should be made, decisions that determine the future of the system. Time for bifurcation. Since in the natural contract, Serres described mankind as a universal parasite, always taking without giving, the contemporary crisis is the clear expression of the morbid state of mankind, of an imbalance in our system of exchanges with the world. By intercepting the circular relation of mutual exchanges, taking and giving in return, we humans, the parasites, introduce a linear and irreversible time in a system of exchanges by bending the system in our favor. So here we are in a global crisis that inevitably leads to a catastrophe if we move on without bifurcating. It's through the rapprochement between time and weather that Serres introduced his first statement about what is now known as the Anthropocene. Today, I quote, "Today, our expertise and our worries turn toward the weather because our industrious know-how is acting, perhaps catastrophically, on global nature with those same ancestors, though, didn't depend on us. From now on, not only does it doubtless depend on us, but in return, our lives depend on this mobile atmospheric system. So the crisis is marked by the introduction of a feedback loop in the linear arrow of time. Nous dépendons enfin des choses qui dépendent de nous. This mutual dependence creates a kind of vortex, a kind of turbulence that could or should herald a new era, a new history. So let me now turn to the comparison between the Serres diagnosis and the diagnosis made by the scientists who promoted the term Anthropocene in 2000. It has been introduced by Paul Crutzen, an atmosphere chemist, in 2000, and it refers to a new geological age viewed as the period during which human activity becomes the dominant influence on climate and the environment. Paul Crutzen suggested that the Anthropocene began in 1784 with the invention of steam power. However, the onset of this new epoch is still debated by geologists who consider the nuclear test of the 1950s as also good candidate markers of the Anthropocene. But whatever the date that will mark the official beginning of this new geological epoch, the Anthropocene explicitly connects human history with the history of the Earth. They can no longer be decoupled as they were in modern philosophy. The connection is expressed in terms of scales of magnitude. It highlights that the impacts of human technological activities are so global that they have reached a planetary scale. It also highlights the clash of time scales. In less than 200 years, we have consumed fossil fuels that nature made through 100,000 years. In a landmark paper entitled The Trajectory of the Anthropocene, The Great Acceleration, Will Stephen, who is a major figure of the Anthropocene, wrote, I quote, "In little over 2 generations or a single lifetime, humanity, or a small fraction of it, has become a planetary scale geological force. Hitherto, human activities were insignificant compared with the biophilosophic Earth system, and the two could operate independently. However, it is now impossible to view one as separate from the other." So the Anthropocene builds up a dramatic story, a kind of ground narrative with 3 distinctive features that are also found in Michel Serres' Grand Récit. First, it blurs the modern dichotomy between nature and culture, between the universe and human species. Second, the key message is that human action has a global impact on the planet, what Serres had already developed through the concept of world objects. And third, the narrative is recounted by the things themselves in the form of traces or signatures of human activity in the sediments. And we know that for Serres, things record the history and record time. And so they are very, very close, they are very similar. However, Serres' Grand Récit significantly differs from the scientist narrative. First, the Anthropocene narrative is a dramatic story whose hero is a mythical anthropos in a Promethean pattern. Serres also singularized the action of humans. He uses, and the series starts with hominicets, which is an allusion to the Latin etymology of humans. Still, by using the inchoative suffix essence, Serres puts the emphasis on the process rather than on the advent of a new epoch marked by the impact of human technologies on climate and Earth's history. Although in times of crisis, Serres presents the Anthropocene as an event, when he wrote, "The world is falling on our heads," he is less concerned about periodization than about the long continuous process of anthropization of the earth that started with the emergence of agriculture. Unlike Isabel Stenger's intrusion of Gaia into our history, Serres is not announcing the time of catastrophes. He's not interested in that, in the reversal of the arrow of the progress. He's much more interested in the idea that man is responsible for climatic disorders. And what he means, it doesn't refer to a fixed entity when he says that we are responsible, but he refers to a species in the making. How we have seen in the previous presentation, the hominiscence is an open-ended process, and it suggests that there is no end to the process of hominization. It's never completed, it always remains contingent and uncertain. Humans are increasingly dedifferentiated in their bodies, and there is no telos, no evidence about its future. A second major distinctive feature between Serres' diagnosis and the Anthropocene diagnosis is that the people, Kreutzen and Wilstephen, view the Anthropocene as a question of great acceleration. It's just a question of speed. We human, we have consumed the natural resources, fossil fuels in particular, and it reaches such a point that anthropos acts as a geological force. Serres also insists on the equipotence of humans and the world, but he rather refers to the spatial dimension of the globalization of human impact. Atomic bombs, nuclear waste, internet are all world objects whose dimensions reach the extension of the world. And in attaining universal, they colonize the world and detach us humans from localities. I quote, "Absent from the local, we find ourselves present in the global space, trawlers, wandering, or lost." So for Serres, humans no longer have home, no longer have a niche, as 90% of human population now live in urban areas. We have lost the pagus, the pays of peasants. A third distinctive feature of Serres' approach to the Anthropocene is the emphasis on the reversal of the relations between humans and the world, especially the relations between subject and object. In times of crisis, he wrote, I quote in French because I couldn't get the English translation. Voyez le monde, en effet. Nous ne pouvons pas ne pas savoir qu'en l'état actuel anthropocène, so here he uses Anthropocene as an adjective, nous l'avons façonné comme un objet, et nous voilà soudain affolés par lui, parce que, devenu sujet, il nous tombe sur la tête. Le monde nous tombe sur la tête. So the world, biogea, can no longer be treated as an object. It's manifesting itself as an active subject, acting and reacting, even taking its revenge on human domination. So while the dramatic element in the Anthropocene discourse is the coupling of human history and natural history, the interference between culture and nature. For Serres, in Serres' Grand Récit, it rather emphasizes the reversal of the balance of power between two agencies. It is basically a question of ontological politics. Unlike the champions of the Anthropocene, Serres is concerned with the promotion of Biogia as a subject, as a partner with whom we have to negotiate our survival. He even suggests that the Anthropocene rehabilitates Auguste Comte's view of the world as a big fetish, a mythical figure. Our attempt at emancipation from the world turns into our dependence upon the things that we dominated. This complex dynamics of interdependency is the major difference between the scientist discourse and Serres. The scientists are still thinking in terms of a face-à-face between humans and the world. And they very much expect that we can go back to the old time when humans were decoupled from the world. In particular, the article I mentioned, the landmark paper of 2015, ends on the following question. Will the next 50 years bring the great decoupling or the great collapse? So the hope for them is to regain the privileged status of humans emancipated from nature as master of the world for those who advocate geoengineering, or at least as stewards of the planet. Serres, by contrast, claims that the interdependency between us and the world is our only chance of salvation. It's the only opportunity, it's an opportunity to size by shifting from parasitism to symbiosis. Thus, for Serres, the Anthropocene is an invitation to give up the modern anthropocentrism in favor of a more symmetrical relation with the world. He thus clearly breaks with the human exceptionalism of Western culture. It's time to quit the acosmism of our political game and listen to the voice of Biogia. But what kind of strategy Serres proposes for this new reversal? In time of crisis, he restores a kind of human exceptionalism due to the order of magnitude of science. The Anthropocene prompts another reversal between our knowledge and the world. I mean, the infinitude of knowledge and progress faces the world's finitude. I quote Times of Crisis. Nous croyons à notre faiblesse et à la puissance d'une nature qui nous accablait, à la finitude humaine, donc, et à l'infini du monde. Nous pensions, courageux, que toute notre histoire consistait à lutter sans cesse contre une force toujours plus haute et plus profonde que la nôtre. L'image se renverse. Nous savons désormais que nous sommes infinis de raison, de recherche, de désir, de volonté, d'histoire et de puissance. Voici le début de l'ère dite anthropocène, où les humains auront à jouer face à cet obstacle de tout autre coup que dans leur stratégie passée. So here we see that Serres wants to play a three-way game: science, society, and Biogia. In 2004, Serres revisits the natural contract with the addition of science as a major actor in the contractual relations between human society and nature. Indeed, he doesn't advocate geoengineering or even a stewardship of the planet, for that matter, like the champions of the Anthropocene. He rather promotes scientists as spokespersons and amplifiers of the voice of Biogia. Through their research in agronomy, climate science, biology, biogeography, they speak in the name of water, air, fire, earth, and life, of the material things that make up the world, gathered in the compound name water. Indeed, Serres is not naive enough to believe that science always works for the common good. He has always claimed the opposite, actually. Therefore, in 2009, he proposes an ethical engagement of scientists to ban all research that could bring or increase violence, destruction, inequalities, in the form of a professional oath of scientists comparable to the Hippocratic oath taken by any physician. To be reliable spokesmen for the biosphere, scientists must swear not to serve any military or economic interest. And scientific data must be entirely open within everyone's reach to guarantee a participatory democracy. As I am not convinced by these ethical or legal measures, I don't think they are up to the gravity of the crisis. I will suggest to end my presentation to go further than Serres, and I venture an alternative strategy that could be labeled timescaping the Anthropocene. In my view, it is in line with the rule of Serres' work because it takes seriously his plea to listen to the things gathered under the umbrella waffle. Up to now, the public discourse about ecological transition have been based on Barry Commoner's famous plea, closing the circle. All environmental movements agree that the linear arrow of economic growth and technological progress is not compatible with the cycles of nature. Consequently, they have advocate a circular economy based on recycling and life cycle analysis from cradle to grave and now cradle to cradle. Although such practices are undoubtedly vital and necessary to respond to the ecological crisis, they are far from sufficient in my view. Why? Because they do not pay attention to the variety of regimes of temporality that have to be composed in order to build a common world. Listening to the various materials that compose the world around us, we quickly realize that each of them have a ecological life of its own. Plants, trees, microbes, insects, and humans all have a time of their own, and their life trajectories interfere constantly. Science tells us that the cycles of water, air, fire, earth, and life are intertwined in complex assemblage that involve a variety of chemical elements, such as carbon, nitrogen, oxygen. Each element of the periodic system has its own cycle, sometimes various cycles. Carbon, for instance, has at least 3 different cycles. Carbon trading typically refers to the carbon cycle initiated by living beings. Animals burn carbon calories, they release CO2 in respiration that is broken down by plants in photosynthesis, which releases oxygen. Climate scientists add to this carbon cycle another cycle controlled by temperature. And to these 2 cycles, geologists add the geological carbon cycle on the scale of 1 million years. The CO2 released in the atmosphere by volcanic eruptions or underwater sources is sequestered in the soil and taken up by rocks in sediments. So the 3 carbon cycles operate on different time scales, ranging from a few years, the biological cycle, to million years for the geological cycle. So the Anthropocene clash of temporality is not just a clash of tempo, to resume Serres' famous favorite distinction between tempo and reason. The various cycles follow their own tempo and also their own reason. Consequently, they have antagonistic and non-linear effects on the Earth system. The CO2 life cycle, having a stabilizing effect, has long been the symbol of the balance of the economic of nature. But it's not at all the same for the climate cycle of CO2, which has a destabilizing effect. It works in the opposite direction to the geological carbon cycle, which functions more like a thermostat for the planet. So it's the conflicting cycles of carbon that lead to the current alarming situation. The global health crisis due to the parasite SARS-CoV-2 also exemplifies the need to take into account the interference between the multiple regimes of temporality on the Earth. And this parasite, the coronavirus, forced us to experience otherness. This harmful virus has its own time, its own trajectory that uses humans as a host. The challenge for us is to learn how to deal with such parasites, to compose a timescape combining the exponential growth of beings that develops through contamination with the beats of political time, economic time, social life, as well as with the time of our individual projects. For this purpose, we have to change our lifestyles, give up the long distance trips for mass tourism or for academic meetings, integrate barrier gestures in our daily routines. We are learning a way of life that is attentive to the infinitesimal beings, microbes, viruses. And microbes in general shake up the modern ontology and bring a kind of ontology that Serres really recommended. They force us to revisit the spontaneous hierarchy that places the ascent of man at the tip of the arrow of time. Microbes have been around long before the emergence of humans, and they will be here after us. By colonizing space, microbes and viruses also defy chronological time. They mix up all time scales that our culture strives to distinguish. They connect biochemical history and the history of human civilization. Well, I'm not going to enter in more detail about this timescaping of the Anthropocene, but I would like to emphasize that the idea is really to come up with a political and ethical solution to the crisis, which enacts Serres' ideal of symbiosis as the after parasitism. And so to wrap up, I would say that by the end of his life, Serres has developed a personal interpretation of the ecological crisis that echoes or mirrors the concerns and discourse of natural scientists, while at the same time weaving together concepts of his previous works, like parasites, things as subjects, world objects. So it's a kind of combination of his entire work and entire philosophy with the Earth system science that were emerging. And he clearly perceived the crisis as a critical moment, inviting bifurcation and reorienting the future. However, the prospects for ending the crisis outlined in times of crisis testify to a trust in science that is at odds with Serres' previous and complex view of science and technology. My proposal of timescaping Biogeia, or the Anthropocene, based on the polychronic framework, seems to me more faithful to his own description of space and time as landscapes of percolation rather than as a linear sequence of periods. Thank you for your attention.
Questions, comments? Well, I'll state this very quickly because I'm not sure. Anyway, I'll state it very quickly without saying at length why. What time scale or timescape does crisis belong to? I mean, surely in a view of the universe, the cosmos, the Earth, that takes account of all of the time scales and all of the rhythms of elapse, there's no crisis at all. I mean, little perturbations in our species probably are scarcely register. So how does one know? I suppose how does one know that we're in a time of crisis?
Yeah, that's a good. How do we know we are in a time of crisis? It's mainly because science tells us, but also because we feel it. We feel the climate change. We experience it, and it's we really, and the virus crisis is also something that we feel in our body. We experience it. It's a body experience. And in my view, we experience it as a thickness which affects not only humans, but also the world. It's the first time that we have a common experience. We are sick and the world, the planet also is sick. I feel it like that. I don't know if it's more a feeling than an argument.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm very interested in your idea to map regimes of temporality. But could you say more on what that might mean? So what would that mean beyond the kind of climate zones where species are so-called naturally at home? I don't know. I can't really imagine what that would mean to territorialize regimes of morality.
Yeah. Timescaping the Anthropocene or territorialize, first it means that it's living in a niche again, accepting local embedment in an ecological niche. I mean, it's really living locally, even if we have to think globally. But we can act locally, and we have to act locally. So for me, it's the dimension in the timescape. It's really the territorialization, which is important, re-territorialization of especially of technological action, because it's timescaping. I think of it as a kind of heuristic category for making technological choices. We would never have choose nuclear technology, for instance, had we thought in terms of different regimes of temporality, because radionuclides, they have their own time, they have a time of their own, which is independent from any other time on the Earth. It only depends on the law of physics, of nuclear physics. Whereas the time of every other thing on the Earth is they are mutually dependent, interdependent. We depend on the Earth, but the Earth also is dependent on us. to a certain extent. The earth is also dependent on microbes and things like that. So to me, it's really, it can be a heuristic category for making technological choices and political decisions.
Can I have one follow-up? So then, because you are beautifully talking about the relation between rhythm and tempos, but in order to keep them apart, there needs to be a kind of a standard, no? A metronome, something like that, with respect to which they can be distinguished. And I'm wondering then what would play that role, because the unit of light speed is the element, if the unit really in which we count time in the sense of years, also with regard to the distance to the Big Bang. But every organism, like you are pointing out, has a kind of a bouquet of temporalities which it embodies. So what could be this kind of metronome that would standardize such a landscaping or a laying out of the territoriality in your thinking?
Of course, it's the chronological time scale. We cannot dispense with it. But there is an overemphasis on the chronological time scale, on the standard time, okay? And which really prevents us to look at the qualitative difference between times and temporalities. It's not just cyclic time as opposed to linear time, but it's also all varieties of times, folded times, crippled times, or whatever that Serres and also Deleuze were described and took into account. So it's really emphasizing this kind of variety of trajectories, of temporal trajectories that could be useful today.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for a wonderful talk. Indeed, the link between how Deleuze talks of chronos and aion is interesting maybe here. Aion much more as a kind of an intervention, something which doesn't have a present, but that somehow interacts with the present. And I think that matches really nicely with your ways of rethinking human responsibility. And I'm always surprised that Serres did not openly, like someone like Bruno Latour, links his work to what, for instance, Donna Haraway has done when it comes to rethinking responsibility and our relationship to others on this planet. But still, in Serres, it's so obvious that he is in search for as you call it, to move from a parasitism to a symbiosis. So, yeah, more or less a comment, but I very much like the idea of responsibility and of thinking different forms of time, perhaps with Deleuze in the end.
Yeah, thank you. I think that symbiosis can be achieved only through this arrangement with other times. Look at the bacteria, our gut bacteria, the microbiome. It's really, we don't share the same time, and it works. So the miracle is that with extremely different times, we can make successful symbiosis.
Only time for one more.
Americans, I don't know that much. Okay.
Okay, I see you. There are lots of statics, so please speak slowly, and because I have difficulty hearing people from the audience.
Okay. I will try to speak slowly. So my question would be about the relationship between infinitude and finitude that you mentioned, and that's also important in the natural contract. And I think I have a question kind of carrying around with me sometimes, how the natural contract also relates to something that probably the Anthropocene discourse has as a heritage, namely the Club of Rome, and the idea of planetary boundaries, and a very specific relationship between finitude and the infinite, which has also been sometimes criticized as neo-Malthusian. So I'm wondering how you think Serres sits here within this early discourse of the limits to growth, and whether he inverts thinking infinitude and finitude, or whether he's more or less in this line.
I don't know where he stands, because first, and he's very ambivalent, you know. In my view, I don't know, because I didn't talk to him in the 2000s. We were completely working separate track, but I'm not sure that he still had this idea that science and technology could be infinite. There is a kind of, well, I don't know, because I never asked him directly, but there is a kind of fascination by the, of course, natural resources are finite. He admitted that, sure, but the idea that knowledge is infinite, it may be for him a strong conviction. And knowledge and technology, because he pretty much considered technology as applied science to a certain extent.
Thank you. I think we'll have to leave it there. Please join me in thanking Bernadette Bensaude Vincent.
Thank you. Thank you.